Spotlight, where I chat with creative, fun, and talented people in and around pop culture. Today, I'm joined by acclaimed author Lois Lowry. Her books have won Newbery Awards, been adapted into movies, and have inspired so many readers like me. She has written over 40 books, including Number the Stars, The Giver, The Willoughbys, Sun, Anastasia Krupnik, A Summer to Die, Messenger, The Silent Boy, and so many more. Now, without further ado, please welcome Lois Lowry.
I'm so inspired by your book, and I'm wondering what inspired you as a child?
Well, I have to think back a long way because I'm 85 years old next month. But I was very lucky, I bet you were too, to be born into a family that valued books. And I had a mother who had been a teacher before she married. She was a wonderful mother to little kids. And she read to me and my sister. And so I think that was the beginning of my love affair with books. But also, my sister was 3 years older.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was 3 and she was 6, she started school. And you know what happens when you're 6 years old and you start school? You learn to read.
Yeah.
She came home every day and she would say, "Let's play school. I'll be the teacher." And she taught me to read when I was 3 years old.
Oh, wow.
So I was a very enthusiastic, I can't think of another description, but a voracious, that's a good word, reader of books all my life. And by the time I was, probably 8 or so, I knew that I wanted to be a writer of books. But in those days, little girls grew up to become wives and mothers, and we never thought about working. We always assumed we'd have a husband who would be the guy who went to work, and we'd be the teacher, the mother that stayed home. And in fact, the books that we learned to read with, the little reading textbooks in first grade, that's the kind of family they're portrayed. There was mother and daddy and Dick and Jane and baby Sally, and there was a dog named Spot. And mother was always wearing an apron. So that's what I expected when I was a little girl. That's what I looked ahead to. And then when I got to, junior high school, and then college, of course, I knew that I wanted to do more than be just a wife. And I majored in writing in college. I went to Brown University. That's what I looked forward to being, and that's what I studied to be. So I've been very fortunate to be able to do what I love best.
Yeah, and do you have a process for when you're writing? Like, is there like a process that like every time you write a book you use?
Every book I write is different, and I've written 50. So that's 50 different ways of going about it, but there's some things that all 50 have in common. And one is that I start out with an idea. And I'll give you an example since you know the book, The Giver.
Mm-hmm.
I began thinking about memory because my father was getting old and he was beginning to lose his memory. And I began to think, what if there were a way that scientists could find to manipulate human memory so that people wouldn't have to remember any bad things from their past? My father, for example, had forgotten about my sister, and she died when she was young, and I suddenly realized Dad had forgotten that. And it made him feel very comfortable not to remember the worst thing that had ever happened to him. But at any rate, I began to think about that a lot, and I decided to write a book about people who had found a way to manipulate human memory. And then, of course, it had to be set in the future. And I've never been a science fiction writer. I don't even like to read science fiction very much. But suddenly I was writing a book set in a future time. So that was the idea I began with, and every book begins with an idea.
Yeah.
But then the important thing next is the character. Who's the main character going to be? And interestingly, that comes to me almost magically. A character appears in my imagination, and I can see them. I see what they look like, and even more interestingly, they come with a name. So I don't have to get out a telephone book and look up names or look for baby names. My characters appear with names, and I very seldom change the name that comes first. Jonas in that book appeared, he was almost 12, and he had a name, and I didn't change that name. I didn't know, of course I knew Jonas would have friends,
Mhm.
but I didn't know who they would be. So I had to create Asher. Again, he came with a name. And the girl, Fiona, his best, I don't want to say girlfriend because she isn't really.
Yeah.
However, when they made the movie of The Giver, and they told me they were going to make the kids older, because in the book they're 12,
And they're like seven, like
and in the movie they're about 17, I said, well, okay, that's all right, but please don't turn it into a romance. And they said, oh, we won't. And yet, there's a little hint of that. It wasn't too much. I didn't hate it. So that's the second thing.
Mhm.
And the third thing is starting. I don't make outlines and have index cards, all of that. Many writers do, very
Mhm.
organized. I can't do that. I start with the beginning scene in which it introduces the character, but it also lets the reader know that something is a little wrong.
Yeah.
But I don't spell out what's wrong because I want them to turn the pages to find out. So the first page of The Giver, it says, it was almost December and Jonas was beginning to be frightened. First sentence. So the reader thinks, what's he frightened of? And
Yeah.
so you read the next sentence, turn the page. Um, so that's my process. And then as I go along from there, I surprise myself because I don't have an outline. I sort of know what the destination is going to be, and then I head as if you were taking a trip. I set out on that road to that destination, but along the way, other people appear. There's a guy standing on a street corner, and he says, "Let me in. I want to be in this book." And then you run into bumps in the road. What's it called? Detours. Hey, you can't go through here. You have to go around. And that's the way I go along until I get to the end.
Wow, that's actually a nice process. I actually interviewed two other authors we sat for my series, and none of them were like that. I like that process, honestly. It's kind of
Do they use outlines?
I think they were a little while ago, so I don't
Yeah,
remember off the top of my head.
yeah,
But I think they at least one of them said she uses or they use note cards. But yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, but I've interviewed, like I said, I've interviewed some actors from movies, and I know they're sometimes affected by the characters that they play. Are you affected by the characters and like what they go through when you write? Like for example, with Jonas's journey in The Giver, do you find your mood or emotions changing throughout when you're writing?
Yeah, when I start a book, and it takes, oh gosh, sometimes it takes as long as a year to finish a book. So I'm working on it all the time. And even when I'm not at my desk, at my computer, typing words in, it's still there in
Yeah.
my head. And it's as if I have my real life going on. I have a husband, I have children, I have grandchildren, I have friends, but I also have this family that I'm living with inside my head. And they seem very real. Of course, I'm not stupid. I know they're fictional characters, but they're always there, and they do affect me. And when bad things happen to them, I feel sad or scared, and I'm always traveling along with them, waiting for the next thing to happen.
Yeah, that's how actually I honestly feel too. In movies and books, like I feel like when they're like something like they're happening and like they're hurt or something, I feel like almost like a feeling in my throat that's like, oh, I feel
Yeah.
so bad for them. And actually leads right to my next question I wanted to ask you. Did you think like what do you think about the movie to the book? Was there like anything you wanted to change with the movie that you didn't like and like things that you did like about it?
Yeah, uh, I I think there had been two movies made of other books by me
Mhm.
before The Giver, and since then there's been one more. So I've always realized, and this was before any movies were made of my books, I've always realized that a movie is not going to be the same as a book. So you have to accept that and not wring your hands about it. And one of the reasons that's particularly true with The Giver is this. A lot of what happens in The Giver happens inside the head of the boy. It's his thoughts and his feelings. And a movie can't show that. I mean, they have to show it. They can't enter the consciousness of the boy. So they have to add action.
Yeah.
And so I was aware of that going in. And I could have done without the car chase. Every movie seems to have a car chase, and that seemed kind of silly to me. But I will tell you a part of the movie that I thought was better than the book. Two things. Actually, now I'm thinking about it. One was the chief elder, who was played by Meryl Streep.
Yeah.
And Meryl Streep is such a wonderful actress. In the movie, it's a very small part, but she is able to do so much just with her tone of voice or the look on her face that you knew there was stuff going on inside her, and none of that was in the book. I liked that. But
Yeah.
here's the thing, one scene that I really loved. You know, in the book, the boy has, I don't know, what shall we call them? The giver gives him these perceptions, the kind of visions that he has.
Mhm.
And toward the end, when he's planning to run away and try to save the baby, the giver says to him, again, I don't have it here in front of me, but it's something like, I'm going to give you memories of courage and strength.
Uh-huh.
And I don't remember how I described that in the book, but I do remember when I saw what they did in the movie, it took my breath away. They were able to, they used familiar pieces of history.
Oh,
They
yeah.
used the young man standing in front of the tanks in China. That had actually happened. It was a piece of history. Nobody knows what happened to that man, but he stood there in front of the tanks threatening to run over him. And the scene of that young man standing there is such a scene of courage. But the other one that I remember most in that vision was Nelson Mandela, who had been in prison for I've forgotten how many years in South Africa, the great leader of South Africa. And he had just been released from prison, and they had taken this from a news film, I guess. And there he is dancing in the streets of not Johannesburg, Cape Town, with the people singing and dancing around him. And I just choked up. And interestingly, they made that movie of The Giver in South Africa. They filmed it there. And they invited me to come and watch for a while, so I went over there for a week. And it was exactly the time in South Africa when Nelson Mandela, who was then president of the country, when he died. And so the whole country was in mourning, and everybody was talking about him. And that's when they filmed that scene in the movie. So that's a part of the movie that I like better than I was able to do it in the book.
Yeah, that's cool. I never knew that. Or well, I probably wouldn't, there's no way I would have known that if I talked to you, but I'm glad I know it now.
Yeah.
And when you like your writing makes the memories, I feel like so easy to understand and relate to. It's like almost like painting a picture with your words. Do you think the way you describe characters and what they do helps people relate to them more?
Well, let me tell you something you may not have thought about yet. When I'm describing something in a book, if I'm describing a person or just a scene, well, wait a minute, I'm going to start a different way. I got a letter once, this is years ago. I got a letter from a young girl in Denver, Colorado. I still remember her name, though I'm not going to say it. She'd be all grown up now. And she wrote to me and she said she had just read a book of mine. It was my very first book. That's how long ago it was. And she said, I want to be a writer when I grow up. And she said, when I was reading this book, I could just see this meadow. The young girl in the book is 13 years old, and she's walking in a meadow. And she said, I could just see that. And she said, tell me how you made me able to see that scene. So I wrote back and I explained, and this is true of every book and every scene. I said, I can't take a photograph and show you the photograph, So I see it in my mind. I see it, in this case, a meadow in my mind. And I can't describe for you every blade of grass and every tree and every shadow and every bird. So I pick out the details, a few of them, and give them to you, and then you can create a meadow in your mind. And it's not going to look just like mine because you're creating it yourself. So she wrote back and thanked me. She said she'd just read a second book by me, and that book, she said, there was a scene of the main character is 10 in that second book, and she has a baby brother, or maybe she's 12 because he's 2 years old. He's born when she's 10. Okay, and there's a scene where he's walking down the hall in their apartment. And she said, I could just see him because you described not every inch of him, but she said, I could see his sneakers were untied and the shoelaces were flapping, and his bottom was fat because he had diapers on under his overalls. And she said, I could just see it. And I realized that that's how you made me see it, because you chose those details. Okay. And then she said in the second letter, I'm going to enter a writing contest. Okay. And then I thought, good for her. But I'm never going to hear from her again. We've concluded our back and forth. Next time I heard from her, last time I heard from her, she sent me a piece of the newspaper, the whole page, and there was a picture, took up half the page of her. Big smile. I could still see what she looked like. And the caption was, Blind Child Wins Writing Contest.
Oh, wow.
Doesn't that sort of make your heart thump?
Yeah.
Yeah, and because I remembered her name, not long ago, I Googled her name. It wasn't a terribly common name, and I knew she had lived in Colorado. And I found she's now a lawyer in Colorado.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And do you remember how you came up with the idea of the sled at the top of the hill and why snow was the first memory you decided to give Jonas?
I don't, when I'm writing and when I was coming to that scene and it was time for him to give a first memory, I don't think there was any particular reason why. That just is what came to me. It was a scene. I needed a scene that would be very visual, but would also have feelings attached to it. And for a child who has never been in anything other than perfect weather, I'm sitting right now in Florida, but tomorrow I'm flying to Maine, where it is snowing today. And so I pictured a scene which would cause somebody who had never seen snow to have a very strong reaction to it. Sled, I'm not sure, but interestingly, way back, third or fourth book I ever wrote, a book called Autumn Street, which is autobiographical, though it's fictionalized, also uses a sled as a symbol in that book. I wasn't remembering that when I wrote The Giver. And here's another interesting and kind of funny thing about that sled. The Giver is published in many different countries, and it's translated into 30-some languages.
Wow.
Some countries put the same cover on the book. That old man, I took that photograph myself.
Oh, wow.
But other countries make their own covers. And I'm always interested when they publish a book in another country, they send me a copy. And I can't read them unless it's French, which I took in school. But I'm always interested to see the covers. And the one in Chinese has, I'm trying to remember exactly, it has the boy's face and the giver's face, done by an artist. And in the background, there is snow, and there's a guy on a pair of skis. And I looked at that and thought, why the skis? And it occurs to me, I don't know if this is true, I think maybe it was mistranslated. Maybe they translated sled as skis. I don't know. But there are no skis in the book, and yet they're on the cover of the Chinese edition.
Oh, wow. That's kind of cool, honestly. You'd probably have to translate back into English and see if they've said ski or
I'll have to find a Chinese person to take
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've been lucky to have like incredible English teachers in school that have always encouraged me to read and just like always keep up with reading. And I actually just read The Giver recently. And I know it was first published in 1993, but it feels timeless, I feel like, to me. Like I feel like especially now too, with all what's going on in the world, and over the last 2 years especially. But even with all the changes in the world, I can't imagine like not experiencing new things, even if they sometimes hurt. Do you still find that true to you for you too?
I do. I do. I think it would be very nice if we had nothing to be worried about ever, and nothing to be scared of, nothing to be sad about. But it would also, in another thing about the world of The Giver is that there's also no art and no music and no books. And those three things that I mentioned, art, music, books, are all things that arise out of deep emotion, often sadness. So we need those things in our lives, even though they're sometimes hard to grapple with.
And is there a character in any of your books? I know you've written a lot of books, but that you relate to the most?
Um, three of my books have me as a main character, and two of them are fiction. My very first book was about two sisters, and I was the younger sister, and I named myself Meg in that book. So I relate to that. The book Autumn Street, the one with the sled, is also based on certain events in my childhood. And I'm Elizabeth in that book, very little girl. But the one most recently, this was published right at the beginning of the pandemic, is a book called On the Horizon. And on the cover of that book, nope, I just turned around to see if I had it here in my bookcase, and I don't. But it shows a very little girl standing next to an older woman on a beach, looking out at the horizon. And that's based on this. I was born in Honolulu in 1937. And many years later, I looked at some old photographs, old home movies that my father had taken, and there's a picture of me on the beach with my grandmother who was visiting. And this was a movie, but I had it transferred to video. I showed it to a friend who said, "Look on the horizon," that's the name of the book. And I had never looked beyond myself before. And this friend had been a naval officer, and he said, "On the horizon, you can see the outline of a ship." And he said, "That's the Arizona." He had been trained by Annapolis to identify ships by their silhouette. He said, "That's the Arizona." Now, that doesn't mean anything to you, but the Arizona, not long after that movie was taken by my father, was bombed at Pearl Harbor and sunk. It was a battleship. There were 1,100 young men on it. And it's now a memorial in Hawaii, and those bodies of those young men are still on that ship. And you can go out and to the memorial, and the memorial is built on top of the ship. You can look down and see the outline of the ship. So when I realized that as a little girl, I had stood there with that ship behind me, and I was playing and digging with my little shovel and smiling, and behind me were all these young men, boys really, some of them, who would very soon be killed. I began to think about that a lot. It took me a long time to figure out how to deal with it in a book, but that's what that book is about. So that's the one I think I most relate to.
Are you working on a book right now that you can share a little bit about with me?
Two. One is finished, and it's going to be published next fall. And it's set in the first century, 2,000 years ago.
Oh,
And
wow.
again, I say I always come up with an idea. And this was because during the pandemic, when I was quite isolated, my husband was in the hospital for 10 weeks with COVID, and I couldn't go visit him. I read something about something called bog bodies. I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but over the past 100 years or so, in various parts of Europe, in England, Ireland, Scotland, Denmark, Germany, in northern parts of Europe, they have found bodies buried in peat bogs. Peat is a substance that they dig up and use for fuel. And there's something about the chemistry of peat that keeps these bodies from decomposing.
Oh.
So over the course of many years, they found, I think, close to 200 of them. And most of them have evidence of some terrible injuries, or a rope around their neck, or a stab wound, or a bashed-in head. But in northern Germany, this was the one I read about that caught my interest, they found a body of what they determined to be a 13-year-old girl. And she had a very peaceful look on her face, but half of her hair was missing. She had long blonde hair, but only on one side of her head, and she was wearing a blindfold. And so I began thinking about her. Why had she died? Why was she there? And carbon dating is a scientific method by which they find something's age. They determined that she was born in she lived in the 1st century. So the first part of the book is about the science of this body. And then the next part is a story that I wrote, made up, about this girl and why she died in the bog when she was 13. And then there are 4 parts. The next part of the book is about newer science, because a scientist went to Germany to study this body. It's in a museum in Germany, and had newer methods. Could find DNA, could do MRIs and CAT scans, and said, guess what? It's not a 13-year-old girl, it's a 16-year-old boy. Died of natural causes, malnutrition. So the last part of the book is a story about this boy and why he died.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it was a lot of fun is the wrong word. It was a hard work, a lot of research, but it was a good way to spend my time when I was sitting isolated and not able to. I had to cancel some trips, and and so that's what I did, worked on that book.
Yeah, that's a good use of time, though, while you're doing that.
Yeah, it was. I enjoyed doing it. So that one's done. I'm working on another book now, which is not yet finished. And I don't even know yet if the publisher will like it. Maybe they'll read it and say, we don't like this one. But it's about an 11-year-old girl and her relationship with a very old woman. I haven't determined exactly how old, maybe 90, the woman next door, about their friendship.
Thank you so much for doing this. And I promise to keep this as a memory and share it with so many other people, so now they'll learn about your story too.
Okay, thank you. It's been fun for me.
Yes, it's been very fun, and it was an honor to speak with you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Miss Lowry, for taking the time to speak with me about your process and inspirational stories and memories. It was truly an honor to speak with you. Well, that's it for today. See you next time on Spotlight.